Greetings and thank you for joining us today. This is the Jar of Manna Bible Podcast. This is your host, Alfred Martinez. And I'm glad you're here with us today. We're going to continue in our studies that we've been working through. We've been currently working through and reading through the book of Exodus. If you're new with us, we've been working through and studying each chapter from chapter 1, and we're on our way to chapter 40. If you're returning, I do thank you for coming back to the channel. And so with that, let's just go ahead and get started. There's a lot to cover. This is a long chapter, and I think you will enjoy it. This is the chapter where the 10th plague happens, but also the Passover event and the Exodus event. There's three significant items that do happen in this chapter. If we have time, we'll go through all of them. If not, I might have to break this up a little bit. There's a lot I'd like to cover in the book in the chapter 12, but yeah, there's some good things. I hope that we can get through these and uncover some new discoveries. So with that, let me go ahead and start our study. If you're new with us, we've been reading chapter by chapter. If you'd like, go ahead and grab a Bible, your favorite scriptures, and you can follow along, or you can just listen and watch. I'm going to go ahead and present them on my screen. I'll be reading through Exodus chapter 12 through the New King James scriptures. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And I'll share my screen. So this is the event of the Passover, significant event. This Passover instruction is going to be spoken up at the beginning of the chapter, and there's going to be instructions on how to keep the Passover, how God, Yahweh, would like his people to keep the Passover, because there is going to be an event where he's going to send his angel come through, and you would want to be passed over so that you're not found in judgment of that 10th plague. But before we get there, was where we left off last week, which was the death of the firstborn was announced, actually, and this was the announcement that the 10th plague is coming. So God had pre-warned Pharaoh that unless he lets his people go, that there was going to be one more plague. And you see that in verse 1. One more plague on Egypt, and that's where we are today. That last plague is going to come forth on chapter 12. So you see that Moses and goes to speak to Pharaoh to let him know that there's going to be one more event coming. So unless he obeys Yahweh, that event will come through. So in chapter 12, I'll go ahead and read this like I normally do, and we can read through this chapter together, and then I'll come back to the top and we can study a few verses that are interesting. I think, though, because of the length of this chapter, it's 51 verses long, that I'm going to go to verse 28 today. And with that, we'll try to tackle some issues that are mentioned between 1 and 28. And hopefully in the next session, I'll continue that. This will be the first time I'll break it up a chapter, but I think it's worthy because of the information that's found in this chapter. So with that said, verse 1, the Passover instituted. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, and saying, this month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for the household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of persons. According to each man's needs, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head and its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it, with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and on the seventh day there shall be a holy convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat, that only may be prepared by you. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses, since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a stranger or native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, Pick out and take lambs for yourself according to your families, and kill the Passover lamb. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning, for the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the doorpost, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you. And you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. It will come to pass when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, just as he promised that you shall keep this service. And it shall be when your children say to you, What do you mean by this service? That you shall say, It is a Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our household. So the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then the children of Israel went away and did so, just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. So they did. Okay, so there you have it. This is the instructions that Yahweh God has instructed Moses to tell the Israelites on what is going to happen on this night when he sends forth his angel to come through to take the firstborn. Now, these are the instructions that he tells Moses, and Moses is supposed to tell the people that they need to prepare, they need to get ready, and there's some time, a little bit of time that they have to take what is necessary to take the lamb, to get your house in order, to prepare this feast, this meal, and that you should observe these instructions, because the death angel is going to come through, and when he sees the blood on the doorpost and the lintel, he's going to pass over, and he will spare that family that his firstborn would not be taken. So that's the instructions. And let's go back to sharing the screen. I'll show you a few little interesting items that I'd like to call out. And when we see these instructions, so this is the Lord speaking to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, and he says that this shall be the beginning of your months. So, this is interesting, because this is the beginning of their calendar year. I believe this is Yahweh's official calendar year. It's not the calendar year that we um, observe, which is January 1st in the middle of winter or the beginning of winter, roughly. This is going to be in the springtime, and it corresponds with the reaping of the barley harvest. When you do a little bit of study on the barley harvest, you know that takes place in the springtime when the new growth comes through. And usually the barley was planted in the winter, and so in this month it would be that time where it comes up. So this is the harvest that's presented to the Lord in this feast, and you'll see that when you study the feast of the first fruits and whatnot, which is culminates on here. But the we're mainly focusing on the Passover in this section. Also, the feast of unleavened bread is mentioned as well. We'll go into that a little bit as well. In now verses 3, 4, and 5, it says, "Speak to the congregation of Israel and say, in the 10th month of every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, and a lamb for the household." So you see here that on the 10th day of this month that God has given them, so now this is the first of the months, and then on the 10th day, you're supposed to select a lamb, and it's going to be for the household. And this type of lamb that you're supposed to select is going to be, as mentioned in verse 5, it's going to be a lamb without blemish, a male of the first year, and you shall take it from the sheep or from the goats. So if you tie this into the New Testament, we'll see that when Jesus fulfills this Passover regulations, here you see the Hebrews, um, observing the Passover, because there's going to be the judgment's going to come. The death angel is going to come and take the firstborn of those who don't have the Passover lamb blood on their doorpost. So how this gets translated into the New Testament, we do see that Jesus is known as the fulfillment of this Passover, in the sense that he's the one that's going to be the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. And you see that in the New Testament, and also in the book of First Corinthians chapter 5. Paul, when he writes this letter to the Corinthians, he does mention that Christ is our Passover lamb. And I'll take you there just real quick so that you can see the connection that Jesus becomes the fulfillment of this event. Verses 6 and 7 and 8 of First Corinthians chapter 5, it says, in verse 7, "For indeed Christ, our Passover lamb, was sacrificed for us." And then he says, "Therefore, let us keep the feast." So you see that Paul is still keeping this feast, instructing the Corinthians in this letter to continue to keep the feast. When you read this passage, I'm not going to really go into this chapter of First Corinthians 5 too much, but he does correct them on some error that they were working through. But he does nonetheless tell them that they should continue to keep this feast. So when Jesus is fulfilling this prophecy as becoming the Passover lamb in the book of John, it does show that on the 10th day, you see that Jesus was selected by the people to be the Passover. If you go to John chapter 12, this is going to be verses 1. You can see that then 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany. So here's this story, but giving you some timeline here. Here's before the Passover, and then you have this triumphal entry. The next day, a great multitude had come to the feast. So we're still speaking of the Passover because it was mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, right? 6 days before the Passover. Okay. And so now you have a great multitude had come to the feast. It's this same Passover. When they heard Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him. And they cried out, "Hosanna, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel." So you have these these people who are noticing and observing that Jesus is the King of Israel, and he comes into the house of Israel, Jerusalem, on this 10th day. And so this is where Jesus is coming. It's fulfilling that 10th day where the Lamb is selected, that we read back in the book of Exodus. So we see that in the account of John chapter 12, that on the same day the Passover lamb is being selected in the temple as per the instructions of Exodus. And so this is Jesus being selected. Now, if you continue, it says, let me go back to Exodus real quick. Now, in Exodus chapter 12, back to where we were, it tells you now, not only are you supposed to select a lamb, but what type of lamb. It says, your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You shall take it from the sheep or your goats. So, and then you shall keep it until the 14th day of the month. So the whole assembly of congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. So now these instructions were given to the people at that moment. However, when Jesus was also becoming the Passover lamb, he came in on the 10th day into Jerusalem. They selected him. Now he was to be without blemish. So I'll show you in the book of Luke, there's interesting passage here in Luke 23, and we're going to go to verse 13. Now Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, you have brought me this man to me as one who misleads the people, and indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no guilt. So you see here that Pilate examined him, and they found no fault in this man concerning the things of which they had accused him. So here you have the Lamb of God, Yeshua, Jesus. He came into Jerusalem on the 10th day. Now, this is the 14th day, and to examine if he had any blemishes, like the Exodus Passover, Exodus account mentions. He's been being examined here, and they have found no fault. So here is Jesus, the man, without any blemish. Does it make sense? The original lamb was without fault, without blemish, that you killed for the Passover in Exodus. This lamb, who is Jesus, the Lamb of God, is without no fault, right? He was without sin. They can't accuse him of anything. So here's that interesting passage that does mention that. And then also when they wanted to kill him, it says here in verse 18, and so this is the time where they're going to choose the one to be killed. And they all cried out, all the people, away with this man, release Barabbas, who has been thrown into prison. Okay, but then here, Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus, again called out to the people, but they shouted and say, crucify him, crucify him. So you have the people choosing Jesus to be the one to be killed. He's without blemish. He came in on the 10th day. This is the 14th day of the month. And this is they're keeping the lamb is to be kept from the 10th day to the 14th day. And then Jesus was kept on that whole time. And so later in this 14th day, they're going to kill him. And if we go back to Exodus chapter 12 again, verse 6, it says that now you shall keep it until the 14th day. Then the whole assembly of the congregation shall kill at twilight. So let's go to John. I know I'm taking you back and forth on a few different passages, but I'm trying to show you that Jesus is this Passover lamb that is mentioned originally in the book of Exodus. That was a real lamb that they did, but Jesus is the Passover lamb who takes away the sins of the world. So Jesus, John 19 and go down to 31, you see that therefore, because it was a preparation day that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day, then the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who was crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And he who has seen has testified, for his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you may believe. These things were done that the scriptures should be fulfilled. Not one of his bones shall be broken. Again, another scripture says, they shall look up on him whom they pierced. So there's a lot going on here. There's some different verses in the scriptures that has been taken into account in these several passages. But I want to just tell you that he's dead at this moment. This is the 14th day. But another is they did not break his legs. So that is reminiscent to Exodus, back to Exodus chapter 12. Okay, so the breaking of the legs is mentioned. I didn't read it earlier because it's later in the chapter, but I'll just bring it out real quick. I'll go into this a little bit more detail in the next one. But Exodus 12 verse 46 says, in one house it shall be eaten. You shall not carry any of the flesh outside of the house, nor shall you break one of its bones. So you see how this is the connection where none of the bones of Jesus' body was broken. So we do see that. So let's continue on. It says in verse 13 and 14 that this will be a sign to you, right? Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Now, if you take this passage and you go to First Peter, back into the New Testament, in chapter 1, verse 18 and 20, it reads this: knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as a lamb without blemish and without spot. He indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but he was manifest in these times, last times for you, who through him believe in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. So Peter is mentioning that Christ the Lamb was without blemish and without spot. He was the perfect sacrifice. So this is the blood of the precious blood of Christ that is that we cling to, because back in the book of Exodus, in that time, the blood had to be presented so that the death angel would pass over. Now, since Jesus is our Passover lamb, his blood covers us like the blood covered them, so that when those who believe and obey the commandments of Christ, which are the commandments of God, and your faith is in him, that on your judgment day, the judgment would pass over you, so that you are not being found guilty, just as those who didn't have the blood in the times of the Exodus were. So there's just a little connection there. And go back to Exodus 12. And the last part I want to mention in this session is verse 14. So this shall be a memorial to you, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. And then verse 24, I'll skip down just real quick. And you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. Okay, so what do we do with this? It says that you shall observe this as an everlasting ordinance throughout your generations. It says that you shall keep this service forever. And I want to just make a note here that this Passover event is commonly presented as a Jewish feast. It's actually the Lord's feast. It's his feast. It's not a I'm saying it's not actually a Jewish feast. It's actually a feast unto the Lord. And it says that nowhere does it say in what we've read that is it's a Jewish feast. It says here it is the Lord's Passover. So this is Yahweh's Passover. This is his holy day. And I'm going to take you to Leviticus in chapter 23. We read an outline of all of the Lord's days, his Yahweh's, all his holy days. It says here, these are the feasts of the Lord. And it says here in verse 1 in the Leviticus 23, these are my feasts. So they're nobody else's feasts. They're not presented as, oh, this is this people's feast or these other people's feasts or holy days. These are Yahweh's appointed times, as Moedim, or as also these are his days to be celebrated. He's already provided days to be celebrated. And I'm going to show you just briefly which ones they are. They are the Sabbath day. They are the Passover and unleavened bread. We're getting a hint of that in this reading in Exodus 12. The Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. I'm not going to go through all these today, but I just want to show you that these are the Lord's feasts. They're not anyone else's feasts, but they're his. And when you read the Gospels and you read what Jesus or Yeshua, what he observed, you would know that he also observed these days. And I want to show you another passage in the New Testament. Again, I'm going to go back to where we just already mentioned it in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where Paul the apostle was writing to the Corinthians, and he was telling them to observe this feast in a right manner. It looks like that they were not observing it correctly, but I'll read verse 6 through 8. It says, your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens a whole lump? Therefore, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed, and here's Paul also, just like Peter, mentioning that Christ is our Passover. He was sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So we have Paul here in the book of 1 Corinthians mentioning that he is instructing the Corinthians to observe this Passover feast. Not a lot of people do that anymore, but it looks to me, and maybe I'll do a deeper study on this, but it is something that should be observed in a sense that you observe it as a memorial, not that you need to sacrifice and present blood again and again for the forgiveness of sins. It doesn't say that. It says a memorial. This shall be a holy convocation to you, as it says, as we just read. This shall be a memorial for your generations to come. And so that you don't forget it, right? And then it even says why in verse, let's go back to Exodus 12. It says that you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. It will come to pass when you come into the land which the Lord will give you, just as he promised, right? And this is why. And it shall be when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? That you shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice of the Lord Yahweh, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households. So this sentence is written in a future sense, looking back, right? And that's how we should do. If you observe the Passover, you can observe it and teach it to your children so that they can know that the Lord brought his people, the Hebrews, out from the land of Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered them and their households. So there's the beginning half of this chapter. Chapter 12, there's a lot going over. I didn't really even get into the unleavened bread portion. Maybe I will in the second half, but I want to cut it to an end right now because there's just so much that we can go over in the next half, and then we'll bring it to together. So this whole book, this whole chapter of Exodus talks about the Passover, unleavened bread, the death of the firstborn, which we didn't read yet, and then the Exodus. It's all in this chapter. So I hope that some of these verses that I was able to pull out are going to be helpful to you, where you see where Jesus is the Passover lamb. These people literally observe what, because they needed to get Passover at that time. Now, in our situation, we're going to need a Passover lamb, and God will provide the lamb for the believer so that when your day of judgment comes, he will pass over you. We'll go over that a little bit more in the next session. But for now, I'm going to call it. And I thank you for joining us. I thank you for listening. I hope that you learned some new things and coming on to this broadcast. And I will close it and I will end with this, that you would be blessed and that your family would be blessed. Good night.